She was not supposed to hear it. The house was full of funeral voices, soft footsteps, forced whispers, the smell of flowers already beginning to feel like death. Her husband had not even been buried yet, and her children were already moving through the house like something had changed ownership. At first, she thought it was grief making her suspicious. Then she heard her son's voice through the half-closed study door. "After the funeral, she's the next problem." She stopped walking. For 1 second, she thought she had misunderstood. An old woman hears many things when sorrow is loud enough, but then her daughter answered in a voice so calm it made her blood turn cold. "She won't fight us. She's too weak now. Too weak." They were talking about her, not with love, not with concern, not like children worried about their mother. They were talking like people waiting for the last obstacle to disappear. She stood in the hallway, one hand against the wall, listening to the same children she raised discuss what would happen once she was out of the way. And in that moment, grief moved aside for something far more dangerous, because the old woman they thought was broken had just learned the truth, and she had no intention of being buried next. Margaret had lived in that house for 43 years, long enough to know every floorboard by sound. Long enough to tell which window rattled in winter and which kitchen drawer always stuck when the weather turned damp. It was the kind of house that held memory in its walls, birthdays, illness, arguments, Christmas mornings, long silences after hard seasons, and now it held death. Her husband had died 2 days earlier in the back bedroom just after sunrise. One moment he was still breathing. The next, the room felt wrong in a way she could not explain, empty before his body had even gone cold. Since then, people had been coming and going without ever really arriving. Neighbors with casseroles, church women with soft voices, her children with careful faces and busy hands. Too busy. That was the first thing she noticed. Not grief, motion. Her son Daniel was suddenly interested in paperwork. Her daughter Elaine kept asking where certain files were kept, though she tried to make it sound harmless. Insurance papers, property tax folders, bank documents. "Just in case," she said. "So you don't have to deal with all this alone." Margaret nodded when expected, sat when told to sit, accepted tea she did not want and comfort she did not trust. Grief changes people, she told herself. It makes them practical too fast. Still, something in the house had shifted in a way grief alone could not explain. It started small. A locked drawer in her husband's desk was open one evening when she knew she had not touched it. The old metal cash box from the pantry shelf had been moved half an inch to the left. Not stolen. Just checked, her bedroom closet door, which she always kept shut, stood open twice in one day. Nothing large enough to accuse anyone over. That was what made it worse. Small violations are harder to defend against. They make you sound confused if you mention them. Old, forgetful, fragile, and fragile was exactly how her children had begun speaking to her. Not openly, not cruelly, but in tone. "Mom, you shouldn't be walking around alone right now. Mom, let Daniel handle that. Mom, you need rest." Rest, such a gentle word for removal. By late afternoon, the house had become too full. Too many coats on chairs. Too many whispers breaking off when she entered a room. Margaret excused herself and said she wanted to lie down, but instead of going to her room, she walked slowly toward the study at the end of the hall. Her husband used to handle funeral arrangements there for church friends. It was quiet, private, a room where people spoke plainly. The door was not fully closed. She would later remember that detail more clearly than anything else. Not shut, just enough open for truth to slip through. At first, she only heard Daniel's voice, low, controlled. "We can't drag this out." Then Elaine, "She's not thinking clearly." Margaret stopped without meaning to. One hand went to the wall beside her. The hallway felt suddenly narrow. Inside the study, papers shifted. A chair creaked. Someone exhaled sharply. Then Daniel said the sentence that made the whole world rearrange itself around her. "After the funeral, she's the next problem." Margaret did not gasp, did not move. For one strange second, her mind rejected the words completely, as if language itself had failed. But then Elaine answered. "She won't fight us," she said. "She's too weak now, too weak." Margaret stared at the thin line of light beneath the study door and felt something cold slide under her grief. Not panic, clarity, because it was not only what they said. It was how easily they said it. No hesitation. No shame, no sadness, just planning. Her children were not discussing what would happen if she could not cope. They were discussing what to do once she was out of the way. And suddenly, every small moment from the last 2 days changed shape. The open drawer, the moved cash box. The careful questions about signatures and accounts. This had not started after their father died. His death had only made them bolder. Margaret stayed where she was, still and silent, while the voices inside the room continued. And for the first time since losing her husband, she realized grief was no longer the most dangerous thing in the house. Margaret did not confront them. That was the first decision she made. Not because she was afraid, because the moment you reveal what you know, dangerous people stop being careless, so she stepped back from the study door as quietly as she had arrived. Slow, steady. One hand still against the wall until her breathing settled. By the time she reached her bedroom, her face had changed again, not fully. Grief was still there, but now it had company, calculation. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the folded black dress laid out for the funeral. 2 days ago, it was only a dress for mourning. Now it looked like a costume she would have to wear while pretending she had heard nothing. A soft knock came at the door. Elaine stepped in without waiting. "Mom, are you resting?" she asked gently. Margaret looked up. Her daughter's face was composed, concerned in all the right places, eyes lowered just enough, voice softened just enough. If Margaret had not heard the study conversation herself, she might have believed it. "I'm tired," Margaret said. Elaine came farther into the room. "You should let Daniel handle the paperwork tomorrow. There's too much for you right now." There it was again, paperwork, not memories, not prayers, not whether she had eaten. Paperwork. Margaret let a small silence sit between them before answering. "Your father handled most of that," Elaine smiled faintly. "Exactly, that's why we need to make sure nothing gets missed. Need we." Every word sounded helpful, every word carried a hook. Margaret nodded as if the sentence made sense. "Maybe after the funeral." Elaine studied her for a second too long. Then she crossed the room and adjusted the dress on the bed, smoothing fabric that did not need smoothing. "You don't have to worry about anything," she said. And that sentence, more than the others, nearly made Margaret laugh. Not because it was funny, because worry was now the only thing keeping her clear. After Elaine left, Margaret stood and locked the bedroom door. It was something she had never done in daylight before. Then she crossed to the old walnut dresser and opened the bottom drawer beneath a stack of winter scarves. Hidden underneath was a tin box. Inside were things she had kept private for years. A second checkbook, a spare house key, a small envelope of cash her husband insisted on keeping for the day people become too interested. At the time, she thought he was being cynical. Now it felt like prophecy. Beneath the cash was a smaller envelope with a name written on the front, Mr. Harlan Price, their lawyer. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Her husband had prepared more carefully than she knew, or maybe he had seen changes in the children long before she allowed herself to. She sat down again and thought back over the past year. Daniel asking strange questions about property taxes, Elaine bringing up future planning more than once. The two of them arguing quietly in the kitchen one Christmas when they thought no one could hear. At the time, each moment felt small, separate. Now they were connecting. That was the worst part of betrayal. It makes the past rearrange itself. By early evening, the house grew louder. More visitors, more food arriving, more voices lowered when she entered rooms. Daniel came by next, carrying a folder. "Mom, just some routine things," he said. "Nothing urgent." He placed the papers on her nightstand without opening them. Not yet. Just close enough to become normal. Margaret looked at the folder but did not touch it. "What sort of things?" Daniel gave her a tired smile. "Temporary permissions, bank access, utility transfer." Just in case, just in case. Such a useful phrase, so harmless on the outside, so hungry underneath. Margaret let her eyes rest on him a moment longer than usual. He shifted slightly, only slightly. But enough, he was expecting weakness, expecting confusion, expecting a mother softened by grief and age. Instead, Margaret picked up her glasses, placed them on carefully, and said, "I never sign anything when someone tells me it isn't urgent." Daniel's face stayed calm, but only his face. Inside him, something tightened. Margaret could see it, and in that tiny pause, she understood something important. They were not only waiting for her to fall apart, they were already moving. And if they were already this bold before the funeral, then whatever they had planned for after it was closer than she first imagined. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She lay on her side with the lamp off, eyes open, listening to her own house as if it belonged to strangers. Doors opened softly, closed softly. Footsteps moved down the hallway and stopped outside rooms where no one should have needed to stop. Once, sometime after midnight, she heard the study door open again. Not loudly, carefully. The way people move when they do not want to be remembered by sound. Grief had sharpened everything, or maybe fear had. Either way, the house no longer sounded like home. Just after 1 a.m, she slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The backyard was dark except for the weak porch light spilling across damp grass. For a moment, all she saw was the old swing her husband never fixed because he said broken things should not always be thrown away. Then movement caught her eye. Daniel. He stood near the garage speaking into his phone, not pacing, not crying, not alone with his father's death, talking. Margaret could not hear the full conversation through the glass, but she saw enough. His shoulders were stiff. His free hand kept cutting the air in short, impatient motions. Once he looked back toward the house, not like a grieving son, like a man checking whether the building was still asleep. When he came back inside, Margaret was already in bed again, eyes closed, breathing slow. The next morning, she became weaker on purpose, not dramatically, just enough. She walked more slowly. Sat down more often, let her hands tremble once while lifting her teacup. Age is useful when people have already decided to underestimate it. Elaine noticed first. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't be alone today," she said over breakfast. Margaret kept her gaze lowered. "I'm only tired." Daniel looked up from his phone. "That's exactly the problem. There was that word again, not concern, not care, management. Margaret nodded as if she agreed. "Then I suppose I'll stay out of everyone's way." Neither of them corrected her. That told her more than comfort ever could. By late morning, the funeral calls had started coming in. Flowers, church timing, cousins arriving from out of town. The house filled again with voices and casseroles and careful faces. It was the perfect kind of chaos for hiding things. Too many bodies, too many distractions, too much grief to question details. Margaret used that. While Elaine was on the phone with the funeral home and Daniel was outside speaking to a man from the cemetery, Margaret went to the study. Her husband's desk was unlocked. That alone told her enough. Daniel would never leave something important untouched. If it was unlocked, it meant he had already been through it. Margaret sat slowly in the leather chair and opened the top drawer. Pens, condolence cards, an envelope of receipts, nothing useful. The second drawer held church donation records and old insurance files. Disturbed but not taken. Someone had searched quickly. Not carefully enough to put things back the way her husband always kept them. Then she reached the bottom drawer. Locked. Margaret stared at it for a second. This was the one Daniel had not opened. Or could not. Her husband used to joke that people only respect a locked drawer because it reminds them they are not entitled to everything. Margaret looked toward the hallway, then bent down and reached beneath the desk. Her fingers found the taped key exactly where he had hidden it for 15 years. When the lock clicked open, something inside her clicked with it, not relief, readiness. Inside the drawer was a neat stack of files tied with blue ribbon, a sealed envelope with her name. And beneath both, a flat black recorder no bigger than her hand. Margaret frowned. Her husband hated gadgets. He barely trusted remote controls. Why would he keep a recorder hidden in a locked drawer? She picked up the envelope first. Her name was written in his hand. Margaret, no, my love. No date, just her name. That frightened her more than tenderness would have. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. If anything happens too quickly, do not trust what they put in front of you. Call Harlan first, I mean it. Her hand tightened around the note. Too quickly. Not if I die, not if you feel overwhelmed. Too quickly. That meant he had seen something before he died. Something serious enough to turn into warning, but not clear enough to speak aloud before the end. Margaret looked at the recorder next. Her pulse had started moving differently now. Slower, heavier. She turned it over in her hand until she found the small switch on the side. There was only one file on it. One, she pressed play. At first there was static, a scrape. The sound of something being set down on wood. Then voices, Daniel, Elaine, and her husband, much weaker than she remembered, but unmistakably him. Margaret stopped breathing. Because whatever this was, he had recorded it in secret. And people only do that when they already know the danger is inside the family. Margaret turned the volume down until it was barely above a whisper. Then she leaned closer. At first, the recording was uneven, a scrape of wood, a cough, her husband shifting in his chair. Then Daniel's voice came through, clearer now. "You need to sign this while you still can." Margaret's fingers tightened around the recorder. There was a pause, then her husband answered. "Weak but steady, I said no." Elaine spoke next, softer, smoother, the same voice she used when pretending concern. "Dad, this is only to make things easier later, for Mom too, for Mom." Margaret shut her eyes for 1 second. Even here, even on a secret recording made before his death, they were already using her as part of the argument. As cover, as bait, the recording continued. Paper moved across a desk. Daniel again, more impatient this time. "If something happens and the property sits tied up, we all lose." We all lose, not she loses, not the family suffers, the property. That was the center of it, not grief, not fear, not protection. Assets. Margaret listened harder. Her husband coughed again, a rough, painful sound that made her chest ache. When he spoke, his voice carried something she had not fully heard in his final days. Suspicion. "Funny," he said quietly. "How interested you two have become in timing." Silence answered him first. Then Elaine laughed, not warmly, more like someone trying to smooth the room before it cracked. "You're not thinking clearly." There it was again. The sentence people use when truth becomes inconvenient. Margaret opened her eyes and stared at the closed study door as if the house itself were listening with her. On the recorder, a chair creaked. Her husband spoke more slowly now. "If anything happens too quickly, Margaret decides, not you." The next sound was small but unforgettable. Daniel exhaling through his nose the way he did as a boy when hiding anger. Then came the line that made everything inside Margaret settle into a terrible shape. "That's exactly the problem," he said. Problem, the same word, repeated before death, repeated after death. This had not been born in the hallway yesterday. It had been growing for longer than she knew. Elaine's voice lowered on the recording, almost too low to catch. "She'll sign eventually," her husband answered at once. "No, she won't." A strange silence followed, heavy, alive. The kind of silence that tells you people are looking at each other without speaking. Then Daniel said something that was barely audible. "Then we do this another way." The file ended there. No explanation, no names, no dramatic confession, just enough. Enough to prove pressure, enough to prove intent, enough to prove her husband had seen the shape of danger before he died. Margaret sat motionless in the leather chair, the recorder still in her hand. For a moment, grief returned so hard it nearly folded her in half, not because her husband was gone. That pain was already there, but because he had died knowing. Watching their children circle the house like men around land already marked for sale, and he had left her this, not comfort, warning. A knock sounded suddenly from the hallway. Margaret nearly dropped the recorder. "Mom," Elaine's voice close, too close. "Are you in there?" Margaret's eyes moved fast, the files, the open drawer. The envelope in her lap. She switched off the recorder, slid it into the pocket of her cardigan, returned the letter beneath the blue ribbon files, and locked the bottom drawer just as the handle turned. Elaine stepped halfway into the room. "Oh," she said, "I didn't know you were looking through Dad's things." Margaret let one hand rest on the desk as if for balance. "I was trying to remember where he kept the cemetery papers." Elaine's gaze drifted over the drawers, the desk, Margaret's face, searching, always searching. "I can help with that," Elaine said. Margaret gave her a tired smile. "That's what I'm afraid of." Elaine blinked, just once, small but real. Then Margaret let the smile fade into something softer, older, weaker. "I mean, I don't want to trouble you," she said gently. The tension in Elaine's shoulders eased by a fraction. That was all Margaret needed to see. She was still convincing when she wanted to be. Still dangerous when she thought she was in control. As Elaine stepped farther into the room, Margaret noticed something tucked under her daughter's arm. A new folder, thicker than yesterday's. And this time, Elaine did not place it on the desk by accident. She set it down carefully, deliberately. Then looked at Margaret with the face of a daughter, trying to sound kind while moving a knife closer. "There are just a few things," she said softly. "That really shouldn't wait until after the funeral." Margaret looked at the folder but did not touch it. Elaine had placed it on the desk with too much care for it to be harmless. People only handle paper that way when they already know what they need from it. "A few things," Margaret repeated softly. Elaine nodded and moved closer. Just temporary arrangements, so no one can question anything later. No one, such a useful phrase. It always meant someone already had. Margaret let her fingers rest on the arm of the chair, weak enough to seem tired, steady enough not to shake. What kind of arrangements? Elaine opened the folder and turned it toward her. Pages clipped neatly. Tabs, signatures already marked with yellow stickers. It was all organized with the kind of efficiency grief never produces. Household authority, financial access. Medical discretion in case you're overwhelmed, just until things settle. Medical discretion. Margaret lifted her eyes slowly. That was new, not because she had never heard the phrase before, but because of the speed, the hunger inside it. Her husband had been dead less than 48 hours, and her children were already preparing for a version of her that could be declared incapable. Elaine noticed the pause and lowered her voice even more. "Mom, this is for your protection." Protection. Another soft word with teeth behind it. Margaret looked back at the papers. One of them was not just temporary authority. It was broader than that, durable, quietly permanent if signed at the right moment and witnessed by the right people. So that was the plan. Not just to pressure her, to legally reduce her, to turn grief into evidence, to make her seem too fragile to resist. "Daniel says the bank has already been asking questions," Elaine said. Margaret did not ask whether that was true. It probably was, but liars always hide inside ordinary institutions. The bank, the lawyer, the doctor, they borrow authority before they steal it. She lifted one page by the corner, just enough to read the witness line. Blank. Good, they were not ready yet. That meant they still needed her to cooperate first. A shadow crossed the study doorway. Daniel, he did not enter immediately. He leaned against the frame with one shoulder, as if this were a family conversation happening naturally. But Margaret saw the tension in his jaw the moment his eyes landed on the open folder. "How's Mom doing?" he asked. Elaine answered without looking at him. "Tired, understandably." They were already writing the script for her. Margaret let out a slow breath and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "I can't think clearly right now." Daniel stepped into the room at once. "That's why we're helping." No hesitation, no softness, just pressure wrapped in concern. Margaret looked from one child to the other. They were coordinated now, not improvising, one gentle. One firm, one offering comfort, the other urgency. It would have worked, too, on the wrong version of her, on the woman who had not stood in that hallway and heard the truth. On the wife who still believed grief made people kinder. Elaine slid a pen across the desk. "We don't need everything today," she said. "Just the first 2 forms." Margaret stared at the pen. Such a small object, such a dangerous one. For a second no one moved. Then she did something neither of them expected. She reached for the pen. Elaine's face changed first, not much. Just the smallest flash of relief. Daniel's shoulders loosened. A trap is easiest to spring when the prey finally walks into the center. Margaret uncapped the pen slowly. Then she looked down at the signature line held there by yellow sticker and assumption and said in a tired voice, "Read it to me." The silence that followed was immediate. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, it's standard." "No," Margaret said, still looking at the paper. "If you want my name read every word." Elaine recovered faster. She pulled the first page closer and began reading, calmly. Smoothly, but Margaret listened not only to the words, she listened to what Elaine skipped, to what she softened, to where her voice sped up. And there, halfway down the second paragraph, a clause granting transfer authority over non-liquid assets. The house. Margaret raised one hand. "Stop!" Elaine did. Margaret looked up, and this time she did not bother to seem confused. "Tell me," she said quietly, "why my funeral is already hidden inside your father's." Daniel's face hardened before he could stop it, only for a second, but Margaret saw it. And once you see a mask slip, you never fully believe the face again. No one answered, not immediately, because in that moment all 3 of them understood the same thing. The old woman they thought was fading had just stepped out of the part they wrote for her. And somewhere beyond the study, beyond the flowers and condolences and tomorrow's funeral guests, the first real crack had opened in their plan. The room stayed quiet for so long that even the house seemed to stop breathing. Daniel recovered first. His expression softened, but only around the edges, not enough to look sincere. Just enough to look careful. "Mom," he said, "no one is planning your funeral." Margaret set the pen down with deliberate calm. Then why does that paper talk about non-liquid assets, permanent authority, and medical discretion 2 days after your father died? Elaine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. That was the problem with polished lies. They sound strong until someone asks them to stand still. Margaret rose from the chair slowly. Not because she needed help, but because standing changed the balance of the room. A seated woman can be managed. A standing woman can decide things. Daniel stepped forward instinctively. "Mom, sit down." There it was again, not a request. Control. Margaret looked at him in a way she had not looked at either of them in years, not as children, not even as family. As people she now understood. "You will not tell me when to sit in my own house." Neither of them spoke. She reached into her cardigan pocket and placed the recorder on the desk between them. That small black object changed the air immediately. Elaine's face lost color first. Daniel did not move at all, but stillness can confess more than panic. Margaret touched the recorder with 2 fingers. "Your father was weaker than either of you realized," she said softly, "but not blind." Then she pressed play. The study filled again with the voices they thought belonged safely to the past. Daniel telling his father to sign. Elaine smoothing everything with soft words. The property, the timing. And then the line that silenced the room completely. "That's exactly the problem." The same line, the same word, the same coldness she heard before. When the recording ended, no one rushed to explain it, because explanation only works when there is still confusion. There was. Outside the study, footsteps moved down the hallway. One of the church women calling softly about flowers, a cousin arriving with more food. The house was filling for the funeral. Perfect. Margaret had hoped for that, not witnesses to grief. Witnesses to truth. She reached for the thicker folder Elaine had brought and opened it fully this time. Then with calm hands, she removed the papers one by one and tore them straight down the middle. Elaine stepped forward. "Mom," Margaret raised one hand, and for the first time in years her daughter stopped immediately. "I heard you," Margaret said, "no drama, no shouting, just fact. In the hallway, yesterday. After the funeral, she's the next problem. Those were your words, and now I know your father heard enough before he died to leave me a warning." Daniel's voice came lower now, less polished. "You don't understand how complicated things are." Margaret almost smiled. "Complicated is what greedy people call a simple sin." Then she took the sealed envelope with Harlan Price's name from her pocket and laid it beside the recorder. "Your father did not only leave warnings," she said, "he left instructions." That got Daniel's attention in a way nothing else had. Good. "Harlan is meeting me at the funeral home in 1 hour," Margaret continued. "The will has been reviewed. The house has been placed in protected trust. No transfer, no sale, no access without my signature and his presence. The accounts you were so eager to help with were locked this morning." Elaine stared at her. "You already did that?" Margaret met her eyes. "No," she said. "Your father and I already did." That was the final blow, not because they were losing money, because they were too late. Voices grew louder in the front of the house now. Guests arriving, doors opening, condolences beginning. A house preparing to bury one dead man while 2 living children realized they had buried their chance with him. Margaret picked up the recorder and the envelope. Then she moved toward the door. Daniel's voice followed her, smaller now. "What happens next?" She stopped in the doorway but did not turn around right away. When she finally did, her face looked older than before. But stronger too. "You wanted me weak enough to sign," she said. "Instead, you made me careful enough to survive." Then she opened the study door to the sound of funeral voices and waiting family. And for the first time since her husband died, Margaret was no longer walking through grief. She was walking through the beginning of their loss.